In 2014, I posted a series of videos detailing how the official Who Shot Mr. Burns solution works, as well as proposing 2 alternative theories for who could have done it. If you haven't watched part 1 of this series yet, or need a refresher on the ins and outs of this mystery, please click on the link here. Unfortunately, even after all of that analysis, the real shooter may have slipped through our fingers once again. So put on your tinfoil hats, everyone, it's time to do it again. If Maggie or Marge or Lisa didn't do it, then who actually did? The method for finding the solution is very simple. In fact, the brilliant Lisa Simpson suggested it herself. Follow the money. Who benefits financially the most from Mr. Burns' death? Is it his assistant, who has worked closely with him for many years? Or could it be the school principal, who may once again gain access to the school's oil? Or could it be Bart Simpson, the young man who was once Mr. Burns' legal heir? No. Mr. Burns was shot by the man who had been waiting patiently for Mr. Burns' death for many, many years. The man inching closer and closer to a secret fortune. That's right, Mr. Burns was actually shot by Grandpa Simpson. Now I'll be upfront with you right here. This theory is going to be structured a little differently than the first two because frankly, Grandpa Simpson isn't a major mover or shaker in Who Shot Mr. Burns. The Marge and Lisa's theories are fun because both characters are so active in both episodes, and their statements can be viewed in 2 different ways. Grandpa Simpson is not like them. He does not move the plot, he merely adds a layer of intrigue. He exists to confuse the audience and push us away from the canonical solution. He is just a red herring. Instead, the Grandpa Simpson theory should be viewed as a story told in 3 parts. Who Shot Mr. Burns Part 1, Part 2, and the Raging Abe Simpson episode. These are all part of the same saga between 2 men who simply want each other dead. The backstory of Raging Abe Simpson explains what happens in Who Shot Mr. Burns, and Who Shot Mr. Burns explains why the Raging Abe Simpson episode went down the way it did. They are intrinsically linked to each other in this theory, so they should be viewed as one continuous story. So let's start at the very beginning. Since World War II, Mr. Burns and Grandpa are both involved in a tontine, with the prize being priceless works of art. These are worth potentially millions and millions of dollars. Mr. Burns and Grandpa are 2 of the last 3 remaining, with the third being the mysterious Mr. Asa Phelps. Now, there's a very simple reason why tontines are currently illegal in the United States. It gives people a financial interest in another person's death, and governments usually don't want to encourage that. There is the argument that this is basically how life insurance works, but whatever, call your congressman to complain. The point is that Grandpa and Mr. Burns both have a rooting interest in each other's deaths. Which is really weird to think about it when rewatching the first 6 seasons. All this time the 2 men had been playing the silent game of chicken, just waiting for the other one to die. Kinda adds another layer of interpersonal complexity to Lady Bouvier's lover, huh? Anyway, this lays the foundation of Grandpa's motive for why he would want to shoot Mr. Burns. Let's move on to the events of the episode itself. Grandpa doesn't actually appear until halfway through, when Mr. Burns' oil operation causes the Springfield retirement castle to sink into the ground. Grandpa is forced to stay temporarily with the Simpson family. This is presented as his official motive in the Who Shot Mr. Burns mystery. At the town hall meeting, he outlines that he lost his room, his things, and most importantly, his buddy's collection of sunbathing magazines. That bastard. This is presented as a legitimate motive for Grandpa, but if you think about it, it's kind of weak. Grandpa doesn't actually like living in the retirement castle, as established in many prior episodes, so making him move out isn't exactly a tremendous loss. When he does move out, however, one of the things that Grandpa Simpson packs is his trusty Smith & Wesson. Now why does he do that? It's clearly in the episode to establish Grandpa as a possible suspect, but from a practical perspective, why does he need to bring a gun? Prior to this episode, we didn't even know that Grandpa keeps a gun. Although considering that he hangs out at the military antique store so much, I'm not really that surprised. What this reveals is that Grandpa Simpson is someone who feels he needs to protect himself. And given what we know about his backstory, it kinda makes sense if you put yourself in his shoes. You're in a tontine with an unscrupulous man like Mr. Burns who you do not trust, who has now triggered an earthquake that causes you to have to move away. It makes total sense that Grandpa would feel nervous about this and would be sure to pack a gun. When Marge takes the gun away, Grandpa is so determined to keep it that he digs it up out of the backyard. The Smith & Wesson is a slightly confusing component of the solution because, as we learn in Part 2, Mr. Burns was shot with his own gun. So if Grandpa reacquired his gun, then why wouldn't he just use that to do the job? There are two alternatives. Either he didn't bring it to the town hall meeting, or else he did bring it and simply chose not to use it. The first theory is supported by the montages of characters stroking guns on their laps. Grandpa's gun is not among them and is not actually seen again until Part 2. There is no evidence that Grandpa actually brought it. The second theory supposes that Grandpa recognized that it's better to attack Mr. Burns with a weapon that can't be traced to him. Two of his family members have already seen his gun, so maybe things would become dicey if Burns was shot with those bullets. In addition, it would be fairly easy to wrestle the gun away, and then turn it against Mr. Burns. I mean, the guy can't even crush a paper cup. I think Grandpa is a pretty safe bet right here. But if you need proof, the Raging Abe Simpson episode does demonstrate that Grandpa is, indeed, physically stronger than Mr. Burns. It's impossible to decipher how exactly the confrontation went down between them, although the dialogue does give us an idea of the struggle. The silence and the quietness of the moment is reminiscent of their later meeting at Asa Phelps' gravestone. Grandpa doesn't say a word to Mr. Burns, he simply stands and reveals his flying hellfish key. I think a similar meeting may have happened in Who Shot Mr. Burns. There is the question of Grandpa's character, since the Raging Abe Simpson episode portrayed him as being so loyal and honorable, so it's probably a simplification to say that shooting Mr. Burns was all about the money. I think a decent part of it was about the money, as well as self-preservation from Burns, but I think Grandpa's sense of honor and fair play kicked in during all the Who Shot Mr. Burns evil shenanigans. Between what Mr. Burns did to him, his family, and the town in general, Grandpa could have viewed Burns as an evil man and let that factor into it. As demonstrated at the end of Raging Abe Simpson episode, Grandpa does not view Mr. Burns as being deserving of the Hellfish Bonanza. Moving on to Part 2, Grandpa's role is basically to point the finger away from himself and throw in a little forced senility for good measure. Much like Marge, he quickly jumps on the bandwagon that Smingers did it. But probably the most interesting thing that happens is when Marge finds the Smith & Wesson box. After she walks away, Grandpa whips out the gun and declares, "You're the bee's knees, baby. I missed you bad." When Marge abruptly returns, she asks, "Were you talking to me?" And Grandpa hides the gun and says, yes?" quizzically, like he's confused. Marge shudders and leaves him alone. I've always felt like this scene implies that Grandpa is more self-aware than he seems, and actually uses other people's view of him to get out of awkward situations. Did Marge almost catch him with his gun? Don't worry, just look around and act all confused, and she'll eventually leave him alone. Old Grandpa's just confused again. This would explain why Grandpa goes through various levels of competency throughout the episodes. Why he would be mostly fine throughout Raging Abe Simpson, yet is totally out of it in others. While Grandpa probably is getting a little slower in his old age, I think he's a little sharper than he lets on. There isn't much more to Grandpa's story in Part 2, other than him declaring that they need to bring that awful Homer to justice. You could argue this is either Grandpa blaming again, or just more forced senility. Either explanation is fine for our purposes. However, much like every Who Shot Mr. Burns conspiracy theory, the Maggie accusation at the end is the major sticking point that we need to explain. And ironically, of the three explanations I presented so far, this is probably the most simple, and I feel a little stupid for not thinking of it before, to be honest. Mr. Burns does not accuse Grandpa of the shooting because he can't reveal the tontine. It's as simple as that. Think about what happened at the end of the Raging Abe Simpson episode. The feds show up and immediately confiscate the paintings. The moment the authorities get involved in this art scheme, the whole thing is literally over. If Mr. Burns accuses Grandpa of shooting him, all Grandpa has to do is reveal the tontine and the game is up. GG everyone. Grandpa shot Mr. Burns, and Mr. Burns basically can't do anything about it. They can't get the authorities involved. So Mr. Burns decides to punt and blame the baby. Remember, Maggie was in the parking lot at the time when the shooting took place, so it is reasonable for Mr. Burns, in those few days of saying Homer Simpson over and over again, to remember Maggie and that piece of candy and make up an explanation. It's not a great one, but it'll do, as long as the tontine doesn't get exposed. So that should really close the book on everything. Grandpa took a swing at Mr. Burns can't really do anything about it. Well, not exactly. Shortly afterwards, something happens. Asa Phelps passes away. Oh, it's on now. One of the common observations about the Raging Abe Simpson episode is that they really seem to crank up Mr. Burns' villainy. He had always been a scoundrel, but his evil had always also had a shade of cartoony, with a lot of the painful implications happening conveniently off-screen. Death is much funnier when it's off-screen. It seems weird that, even with only one survivor left, that Mr. Burns would just outright resort to blatant murder. I mean, even Smithers himself observes that it's probably not necessary given Grandpa's health. After all, Mr. Burns is indestructible. Viewing this episode through the lens of Who Shot Mr. Burns, however, and things look dramatically different. Suddenly, the inconvenient Mr. Phelps is out of the way, and now it's just Mr. Burns and the man who tried to kill him. It's not surprising at all that Mr. Burns immediately called his guy. Wouldn't you? I hope the answer is no, because murder is bad and stuff, but it illustrates the point of how personal this episode gets. Not only does Mr. Burns hire a man to kill Grandpa, he even participates in some of the schemes, which is really insane. I love how hands-on he is, but still, really insane. It's also important to note that, once again, none of this stuff is getting reported to the police. This is a very important note, actually. Grandpa shoots Mr. Burns doesn't reveal the truth. Mr. Burns tries to murder Grandpa repeatedly. Grandpa says absolutely nothing. Even when the family is wondering about it, Grandpa clams up. They probably wouldn't believe him anyway, but it's an important dynamic to watch. The episode is continuing the pattern of keeping the authorities out of this affair. They are so close to the money, it has to stay dark. Speaking of dark, let's move on toward the final showdown between the two of them. After Burns unsuccessfully tries to steal Grandpa's key, he ends up tracking them down on the water. He pulls a gun on the two of them and takes the treasure for himself. Grandpa pleads that they can take the treasure, but not hurt the boy. Mr. Burns would rather do both and kicks Bart into the box to be drowned at sea. This is one of the darkest character turns in the series' history, but it demonstrates how personal the feud between Mr. Burns and Grandpa has become. Mr. Burns already has the treasure. Trying to murder Bart is just for jollies. It is Mr. Burns' final revenge for Grandpa shooting him. Things do turn out okay in the end, culminating with the two oldsters fighting it out on the beach. Ultimately, Grandpa chooses to spare Burns' life. After watching him squirm, of course. I think after shooting a man, getting away with it, and then having that man come after him later on, Grandpa decided that enough was enough. The treasure has already been uncovered, both guys took their shots at each other, why spend the rest of their lives trying to kill each other? They're even, let's go home. Unfortunately, things don't go quite as planned as the feds show up somehow and whisk everything away in the blink of an eye. In a weird sense though, this feels like the perfect culmination of the Who Shot Mr. Burns trilogy. Grandpa shoots Mr. Burns, law enforcement never finds out. Mr. Burns tries to assassinate Grandpa, law enforcement never finds out. Mr. Burns tries to kill Bart, law enforcement again, never finds out. Grandpa doesn't kill Mr. Burns in the end, here come the feds. Ultimately, if you subscribe to the Grandpa Simpson theory, you are subscribing to the idea that the writers put a hidden solution in Who Shot Mr. Burns, and then wrote the Raging Abe Simpson episode to unlock that solution. It's a little like how the Marge solution works with the Marge Gets a Job episode, except in reverse. I would say this solution is a little less fun on a rewatch than the other two, if only for how little Grandpa factors into Who Shot Mr. Burns, but viewed as a trilogy of episodes, and there's a lot of fun stuff in there. The explanation for why Mr. Burns accuses Maggie makes sense, and deepens the dynamic between the two men. So there you have it. Grandpa Simpson shot Mr. Burns. I don't know if there are any other alternative theories for Who Shot Mr. Burns, but the Grandpa Solutions provides a different spin on the character than we usually get. It shows that maybe this isn't a guy that the world can just run over repeatedly. Maybe this is someone who would stand up for himself. It feels kind of weird to suggest that shooting a man would give me somehow more respect for Grandpa as a character, but when we're talking about Mr. Burns, maybe he doesn't count. I don't know, there's probably something poignant in there, but at the very least, it's a fun theory to think about. Thanks for watching, everyone.